For 15 years, the long table in the great hall at Calderwood had stood exactly as it was left, and the room had learned to breathe around its stillness, the way a house learns to breathe around a grave. 22 chairs, oak black with age, each one pushed in to the same measured distance from the table's edge, as if a hand had gone down the length of it counting inches after the last meal was ever eaten there. Dust did not gather on the surface itself. The housekeeper saw to that, once a fortnight, out of a loyalty no one had asked her to keep. But it gathered on everything around it. On the sideboard, on the cold hearth, on the drawn curtains that let in a light so thin and grey it seemed embarrassed to be there at all. 3 chimneys smoked at Calderwood that winter. The 4th, the one that served the great hall, had not smoked since the year the old Duke and his Duchess were carried out of the house feet first within 11 days of each other, and their son, then a boy of 19, had ordered the doors of that room shut, and had not eaten a meal within it since. He had gone, not long after, and had not been seen at Calderwood by name for the better part of a decade and a half. The house kept his table for him the way a dog keeps a scent long after the person who left it is gone. It waited. It did not know what else to do. Eleanor Vance did not know any of this on the November morning the story properly begins, because she did not know Calderwood existed, and she certainly did not know that the man mending the fence at the edge of her father's tenanted land, in a coat gone thin at the elbows and boots cracked at the toe, in a line as straight as a ruled margin, was the reason that table had stood empty for 15 years. She knew only that the fence needed mending before the sheep found the gap in it, and that her mother had told her twice already that morning that Sir Reginald Ashworth was coming to dine on Thursday, and that Eleanor would wear the blue muslin, and would, for once in her miserable life, endeavour to be agreeable. She had said yes, Mama, both times, because saying anything else had stopped being worth the cost of it 2 years ago, when her father's investments in Barbadian shipping had failed all at once and the Vance family had gone, within the space of a single dreadful spring, from comfortable to careful to something that did not bear a polite name. Eleanor's blue muslin had been washed so many times that it had faded from the colour of a summer sky to the colour of skimmed milk, and she had let the hem down twice, and there was a seam at the waist that she alone knew about, put there so the dress would still close. She was 23, which her mother mentioned the way one might mention a debt coming due, and she had spent the morning doing the household accounts, because her father no longer trusted himself with numbers, and her mother had never trusted herself with anything, and then she had gone out to see about the fence. Because the steward was ill, and someone had to, and because Eleanor Vance had discovered, in the 2 years since the money went, that she was the kind of person who went and saw about things, rather than the kind who waited in a drawing room for someone else to. The man at the fence straightened when he heard her approach, and something in the way he did it, an economy of movement, no wasted motion, a stillness afterward that suggested he was used to being looked at and had trained himself not to mind it, made her slow her step without meaning to. "You've a gap here big enough for a carriage," she said, because it was true, and because she had never learned the trick of saying something smaller than the truth simply to fill a silence pleasantly. "I noticed," he said. "I was working on it when you came up, if you'll permit me to point that out." It was not quite insolence. It sat just this side of it, in the flat, unhurried way he said it, and Eleanor found herself, against every instruction her mother had given her about how a lady spoke to men who worked with their hands, almost smiling. "I'll permit it," she said, provided the gap is closed by supper. There's a ram in with those ewes that thinks himself a great deal more clever than he is. Most rams do. Most men do. He looked at her then. Actually looked. The way people rarely did any more. Not at her dress or her prospects, or the fading of both, but at her. At whatever was visible in her face in that particular grey November light. And something crossed his expression that she could not name. It was there. And gone in under a second, a door opening a crack on a room he had not meant to show anyone, and shutting again before she could see what was inside. "I'll have it closed by supper," he said, and went back to the fence, and did not look up again, though she stood a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she made herself walk on. His name, she learned from the housekeeper's daughter that evening, was Mr. Aldous Fenwick, and he had come to the district some 4 months prior to manage the neglected land that belonged, so far as anyone locally understood it, to an absentee owner who paid well and asked no questions, and was, by every account, never coming back to look at what he owned. Fenwick kept to himself. Fenwick did not drink at the public house, though he was invited often enough. Fenwick had twice been seen giving half his own dinner to a cottager's children without being asked, and without mentioning it after. Fenwick, the housekeeper's daughter said with the particular relish of a girl passing along a mystery, had a way of speaking that did not match his coat, as though he had been somebody else once, and had not entirely finished putting that somebody away. Eleanor thought about this rather more than she intended to, over the following fortnight, while her mother arranged and rearranged the dinner with Sir Reginald Ashworth, as though it were a battle plan, and not a meal. Sir Reginald was 41, a baronet with land enough to matter, and manners smooth enough to disguise, for exactly as long as it took to secure a thing he wanted. The fact that he did not much care what happened to it afterward. He had buried one wife already, quietly, after a marriage that the servants in that household did not speak of even now, and he had fixed his attention, with the calm persistence of a man selecting livestock, on Eleanor. "He is not asking for love," her mother said, the night before the dinner, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's room, with the particular rigidity she adopted when she had already decided a thing, and only wanted it agreed to, rather than discussed. "He is asking for a wife who will run his house and give him no trouble, and in return your father's debts are settled, and this family does not go under. You have had 2 years to find yourself another offer, Eleanor, and you have not managed it, and I will not watch us lose the roof over our heads, because you have decided you would rather wait for something better than what is standing in front of you." "I have not decided anything," Eleanor said. "You have decided it for me. Someone has to. He frightens the maids, Mamma. Sarah will not go into a room alone with him. Sarah is 16 and fanciful. His first wife died in 6 years of marriage, and no one will say of what." Her mother's face, for one unguarded second, showed something that was not quite anger, something closer to fear, quickly folded away. The way a woman folds away a letter she does not want read. "I know what is being said," she said, quietly. "I have chosen not to listen to it, because listening to it changes nothing about our situation, and I would ask you to do the same." She left before Eleanor could answer, and Eleanor sat a long while at her window afterward, looking out at nothing, her hand finding the edge of the sill without her noticing it had gone there, the way a hand goes to something solid when everything else has stopped feeling that way. The dinner, when it came, was every bit as bad as she had feared, and worse in the particular way that Sir Reginald had, of looking at her as though he were already totalling up what she would cost to keep, and what use she would be for the money. He spoke to her father about her, as though she were not present. He referred to her once as a sensible enough creature for all her opinions, in a tone that suggested this was a fault he intended to correct. Once he had the legal right to. Eleanor sat through it with her spine very straight, and her hands folded very still in her lap, and said almost nothing, because she had learned that the things she wanted to say would not help her father's debts, and would only make her mother's face do that folding away thing again. And she was tired, she found, of being the reason for that. She left the house before the men had finished their port, on the excuse of a headache no one troubled to question, and walked out into the cold blue dark toward the fence line, because it was the one direction that did not lead back toward Sir Reginald's voice, and because some part of her, not fully examined, had hoped to find Fenwick still there. He was not at the fence. He was sitting on the low stone wall a little further on, where the land dropped toward the stream, with no lantern and no apparent purpose beyond being alone in the dark. And he looked up when her footsteps reached him with an expression that told her, before either of them said a word, that he had guessed exactly what kind of evening had sent her out here. "You've the look of a woman who has just been sold something she did not agree to buy," he said. "That is a remarkably specific observation for a man mending fences. I have known one or two women with that look." He shifted along the wall, not quite an invitation, but not one either. And after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor sat, leaving a space between them of perhaps 2 feet, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and no closer than that. "Sir Reginald Ashworth," she said, because saying the name aloud to someone who owed her nothing and expected nothing felt absurdly like setting down something heavy. "My mother has all but signed the contract already. I know the name." Something moved through his voice on those 4 words. Something cold and old, gone before she could ask after it. "You need not marry him. You say that as though there is an alternative sitting somewhere close to hand. There might be." He looked at her sideways, and for a moment the practiced flatness in his face gave way to something more uncertain, more genuinely his own. "I am not a wealthy man, Miss Vance. I will not pretend otherwise, and I would not ask you to pretend it with me. But I have a roof, and a wage that is honest, and I have never in my life raised my voice to anyone smaller or weaker than myself. Which is a low bar to clear, and I aware of that. But it is one Sir Reginald Ashworth would fail." He paused. "If it came to a choice between him and a poor man who would at least be kind to you, I would ask you to think of the poor man. Are you proposing to me, Mr. Fenwick?" "I believe I am attempting to, badly." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, the first one in weeks, and something in his face eased at the sound of it, a loosening around the eyes that he did not seem to notice happening. "You have known me a fortnight," she said. "I have known Sir Reginald Ashworth by reputation a great deal longer than that, and I know which of the 2 of us has never once made you flinch." He was watching her very steadily now. "I do not offer you comfort, Miss Vance. I have very little of that to give. I offer you a choice, which is a different thing entirely, and one you have not been given in some while, I think." She sat with that a long moment, the cold coming up off the stream, her breath showing pale in front of her. "My father's debts. I have some small savings. Not enough to erase them. Enough, perhaps, to buy a delay, and a delay might be all the time we need to think of something better." He was not looking at her now, he was looking at his own hands, turning something over in his mind that she could not see. "I will not lie to you and say I can solve everything. I can offer you a door out of this particular room, tonight, if you want it. What you do once you are through it is your own to decide. It was, she would think later, the strangest proposal any woman had likely ever accepted, made on a cold wall in the dark by a man who owned nothing but the coat on his back, and a curious, quiet certainty that sat oddly on a labourer, and she said yes to it, not because she loved him. She did not yet, not in any way she could have named, but because for the first time in 2 years, someone had offered her a door with her own hand on the latch, instead of one that opened only when someone else chose to open it for her. They were married 11 days later, quietly, by a clergyman 2 parishes over, who asked no questions he was not required to ask, with Eleanor's maid Sarah as the only witness, and Eleanor's mother informed by letter after the fact, rather than before. Because Eleanor had learned, in planning it, precisely how far her mother's fear of scandal outweighed her fear of anything Eleanor herself might do, and had used that knowledge without much guilt. Her mother's response, when it came, was 3 lines long and contained, buried in its fury. One sentence that Eleanor read a dozen times without fully understanding it. You have thrown yourself away on a man beneath you when there was a far better path within your reach. And I will not say more than that, because you would not believe me if I told you what it was. She did not have long to wonder what her mother meant, because 4 days after the wedding, Fenwick, her husband, a word she was still learning the shape of in her own mouth, told her they were leaving for his true home. A place 2 counties distant that he had not visited, he said, in a long while, and asked her to trust him a little further, before he explained why. They travelled 2 days by cart and coach, and on the 2nd afternoon, as the road curved up through bare November trees toward a rise in the land, Eleanor saw a house appear above the tree line that made her sit forward against the window glass, without meaning to. It was enormous. It was grey stone gone gold at the edges where the low sun caught it, with a facade of windows that ran the length of 3 full floors, and even from this distance she could count them. Perhaps 40 windows facing the drive, and of those, all but a handful stood shuttered, dark, closed up like eyes that had chosen, long ago, to stop looking out. Whose house is that? She asked, though something in her chest had already begun, slowly, to guess. Fenwick, the man beside her, whose hands she had held at the altar 4 days prior, whose coat was still thin at the elbows even now, did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had none of its usual flatness in it. It is mine, he said. My name is not Aldous Fenwick. It is Julian Harcourt. I am the Duke of Calderwood, and that house has stood mostly shut for 15 years, because I have not been able to bring myself to open it, and I did not tell you the truth of who I was, because I wanted, for once in my life, to be chosen for something other than the name. He looked at her then, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked afraid. I understand if you cannot forgive that. I would understand it entirely, but I could not walk you through that door without you knowing first. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Eleanor said nothing for the length of time it took the carriage to cover perhaps a 1/4 mile of road, and Julian did not press her, sitting with his hands loose and open on his knees. A posture she would come to understand, much later, as the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself to receive bad news without flinching, because flinching in front of others had never once been permitted him. You let me think you had nothing, she said at last. You let my mother call me a fool for taking you. Yes, you let me marry a stranger's coat and boots, and think I was choosing kindness over a title, when you had the title the entire time and simply did not want it looking at me the way titles look at people. Yes, he did not defend himself further than that single word, and something about the absence of excuse in it, no but, no however, no softening, was, oddly, the thing that reached her. Why has the house stood shut 15 years? His jaw worked once before he answered. My mother and father died within 11 days of one another, of the same fever, when I was 19. I was meant to take up the dukedom the following season, sit at my father's table, host the assemblies he had hosted, become, overnight, everything he had been. I could not do it. I shut the hall he used to dine in, and I left, and I have spent 15 years managing land under other names, because when I am not the Duke, no one expects anything of me that I cannot bear to give. He was quiet a moment. I did not intend to fall in love with a woman while pretending to be someone else. I did not think I had it left in me to fall in love with anyone at all, but you sat down beside me on a cold wall and did not ask my permission to see me. And I found I did not want to stop being seen. She did not tell him that day that she forgave him, because she was not entirely certain yet that she did. And Eleanor Vance, Eleanor Harcourt, now Duchess of Calderwood, a title so absurd against the fact of her faded blue muslin that she nearly laughed aloud thinking of it, had never once in her life said a thing she did not mean simply to smooth a moment over. But she did not ask him to stop the carriage either. And when they came at last to the great shut house, and the doors were opened by servants who had clearly not expected to see their master arrive with a wife on his arm, she walked in beside him, rather than a half-step behind. And something in the set of his shoulders eased at that, the way a held breath finally goes out. The great hall, when the housekeeper, a tall, spare woman named Mrs. Bramwell, who had served the family 30 years, and whose face did something complicated at the sight of Julian standing in that doorway again after so long, led them through it, was exactly as it had been left. 22 chairs. A table so long, it seemed to run the length of Eleanor's understanding of what a table was for. Dust on the sideboard, none on the wood itself. A room that smelled of cold stone and unlit fires, and 15 years of careful, mournful maintenance. You may leave it as it stands, Julian told Mrs. Bramwell, in a voice gone flat again, the old habit of shutting a door on his own face reasserting itself. We will not be dining here. Eleanor said nothing in front of the servants, but that night, lying awake in a bedchamber larger than her entire family's house had been, she thought about the long table and the 22 chairs and the 4th chimney that did not smoke, and she thought that a man who had spent 15 years fleeing a room could not go on fleeing it forever. Not if he meant to actually live in the life he had just admitted, at last, that he wanted. Julian's aunt, Lady Prudence Harcourt, arrived at Calderwood 8 days later. Summoned by a letter he had sent the same night, he confessed the truth to Eleanor, and she came into the house like weather, brisk, cold, entirely certain of her own authority, and visibly startled to find her nephew present at all, let alone married. You have married a woman no one has heard of, she said to Julian, before she had so much as removed her gloves, whose family is, I am reliably informed, 3 seasons from ruin. And you did not think to consult me, your father's own sister, before doing so. I did not think it your decision to make. It is my decision to manage the consequences of, which is very nearly the same thing. Lady Prudence's gaze moved to Eleanor then, sharp and assessing, and Eleanor held it without looking away. because she had learned, from 2 years of her own mother's assessments, precisely how to stand still under one, without giving anything away. Something in that stillness seemed to catch Lady Prudence off guard. "You do not flinch," the older woman said, almost accusingly. "I have had a great deal of practice not doing so, my lady." It was not approval, not yet, but it was not dismissal either, and Eleanor filed the distinction away as something to build on. The first weeks were not easy. Lady Prudence made her opinions known at every meal, meals still taken in the small breakfast parlour, the great hall's doors remaining shut, with a precision that Eleanor came to recognise, slowly, as coming less from cruelty than from a fear she guarded as carefully as Eleanor's own mother guarded hers. Lady Prudence had watched her brother die, and her sister-in-law follow him within 11 days, and her nephew vanish into the countryside under a false name for 15 years, rather than face the house that held their memory. And she had spent that entire decade and a half terrified that the Harcourt line, and everything in it worth preserving, was quietly dissolving into nothing, while no one with the authority to stop it was willing to try. A wife who had married Julian believing him poor, who had no name and no fortune to offer the family in return, looked to her like one more piece of the house, falling away. She said as much once, not to Eleanor's face but nearly within earshot of it, to a visiting cousin over tea in the drawing-room, her voice pitched just low enough to seem private, and just loud enough to be heard by the woman standing at the window arranging flowers. He might have married anyone, any woman of birth and fortune who could have brought something back to this family besides another mouth to feed and no doubt opinions to match. Instead, he has brought home a girl who married him for his boots, or thought she did, which speaks either to remarkable virtue or remarkable stupidity, and I confess I have not yet decided which. Eleanor did not turn from the window. Her hands did not stop arranging the flowers, but something in her chest went very still and very cold, and she thought, not for the first time since arriving, of her own mother's voice doing very much the same work with very much the same words. Years apart and rooms apart and somehow exactly, exhaustingly, the same. She said nothing of it to Julian that night, because she had learned, too, the particular uselessness of complaining about a thing that could not be immediately fixed. But she began, in the weeks that followed, to make herself useful in ways no one had asked her to. Reviewing the estate accounts, which Julian's steward in truth had let slide into a confusion Julian himself had never had the heart to look at closely. Speaking with Mrs. Bramwell about which of the shut rooms might reasonably be reopened, and which linens needed replacing, and which tenant families had gone too long without a visit from anyone above the rank of land agent, and slowly, without announcing it as a campaign, she began to become visibly, undeniably indispensable to a household that had been quietly falling apart around its own grief for a decade and a half. It was in the 3rd week that she asked Mrs. Bramwell, on a grey afternoon with rain coming in sideways against the tall windows, whether the great hall's table might be shortened. "Shortened, my lady?" "It seats 22. There is no occasion in this house that will ever again seat 22. Not for a good while yet, and a room that large, set for a table that long, will only ever feel like what it is now, a monument to people who are gone. But a smaller table, round, set close by the good window, might feel like a room where 2 people could sit down to breakfast." She hesitated. "I do not ask this to erase anything, Mrs. Bramwell. I ask it because I think a house can hold its grief and still, eventually, feed the people living in it." Mrs. Bramwell's face did the complicated thing again. the thing it had done in the doorway the day Julian first came home, and after a long moment she said, quietly, "His Grace's mother used to say the same of that room, my lady. That it was too grand for a family that only wanted each other's company." They did not shorten the great table. Eleanor would not have presumed so far without Julian's leave, but they had a smaller round table built for the breakfast parlour's bow window, of English oak, and Eleanor asked the carpenter, on an impulse she could not fully explain even to herself, to carve into its underside, where no one but the family would ever see it, the date of the wedding and, beneath that, a single word, chosen. Julian found her overseeing its delivery on a cold, bright morning in December, and stood in the doorway a long moment watching her direct the men where to set it, before he came and stood beside her, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, a distance that would have been unthinkable between them on that first day at the fence. "You are trying to fix my house," he said, not quite a question. "I am trying to feed my husband breakfast in a room that does not feel like a church." Something in his face did the thing it had done that very first day at the fence, the door opening a crack, the room behind it visible for a half-second before he shut it again. Except this time, he did not shut it. He let her see it a full 3 seconds, which she would count. Later, as the first time he had ever let anything in his face stay open for her on purpose. "My mother used to say this house needed less silver and more noise," he said. "I have given it 15 years of silver and silence both. I am not entirely certain I remember how to make noise in it. I am told," Eleanor said, "that it comes back rather quickly, once one starts." He almost laughed. She saw it gather at the corner of his mouth and then fold itself away, unfinished, the way she had come to recognize as his particular habit, a hand reaching for something and drawing back before it touched, and she thought, watching it happen, that she would like, very much, to be there the day it finally did not draw back. It was 3 days after Christmas that the trouble properly arrived, in the shape of a letter from Eleanor's mother, announcing that she and Eleanor's father were travelling north to see for themselves the situation their daughter had married into, and that Sir Reginald Ashworth, still unmarried, still, apparently, aggrieved, had asked leave to accompany them, as an old family friend concerned for Eleanor's welfare. Eleanor read the letter twice at the breakfast table, the small round table with its carved secret underside, and set it down with a hand that was not quite steady. "He is not welcome in this house," she said. "He will not be admitted to it," Julian said, "if that is your wish." "It is," but Lady Prudence, hearing of the planned visit, had ideas of her own. A ball was already being spoken of in the county for the new year, the first the Harcourt family would host at Calderwood in 15 years, a fact Lady Prudence had been pressing Julian toward for weeks as proof that the family intended to resume its proper place in society. And she saw in the Vances' visit and Sir Reginald's presence an opportunity to test, publicly, whether the new Duchess could hold her own before the county's sharpest eyes, or whether she would crumble and confirm every doubt Lady Prudence had been nursing since the wedding. "Let them come to the ball," Lady Prudence said, over Julian's objection. "Let the county see her stand up, under her own family's disapproval and Sir Reginald's presence both, and see for themselves what she is made of, rather than hearing it only from you, who are hardly an impartial witness where your own wife is concerned." There was, beneath the challenge in her voice, something that Eleanor, attuned now to the particular music of a frightened woman disguising fear as authority, recognized as its own kind of test. Lady Prudence was not entirely certain, still, whether the family she had spent 15 years trying to hold together by sheer will was strong enough to survive being looked at closely. She wanted, more than she wanted to be right about Eleanor, to be proven wrong. Julian, for his part, was against it entirely, and said so more sharply than Eleanor had yet heard him speak to his aunt. I will not have Eleanor made a spectacle in her own home to satisfy the county's curiosity. It is not the county's curiosity I am concerned with satisfying, Lady Prudence said, and something in her voice cracked, just slightly. Just for a second, a face coming apart and being put back together with a skill that had clearly taken years to learn. Before she added, more quietly, I have watched this family come apart for 15 years, Julian, and I have not known how to stop it, and I will confess to you now that I do not know whether a girl of 23 with no fortune and a great deal of pride is the person who mends it, or the person who finishes breaking it. And I would like, before I die, to know which. It was, Eleanor thought later, the first entirely honest thing Lady Prudence had said in her hearing, and it moved her more than any kindness could have. She went to her before Julian could answer, and said quietly, "Let them come. I am not afraid of my mother, and I have stopped, some while ago, being afraid of Sir Reginald Ashworth. If the county wishes to look, let it look. I have nothing to hide that a good look would find wanting." Lady Prudence studied her a long moment, and something in her sharp face eased, just barely, at the corners. "No," she said slowly. "I do not believe you do." The ball was set for the second week of January, and the great hall, closed 15 years, dust kept from its surfaces by loyalty rather than use, was to be opened for it, at Julian's own decision, made 3 days before the event, and told to Eleanor alone, in the small round breakfast room, with his hand resting flat on the table's carved underside, as though he could feel the word etched there through the wood itself. "I have avoided that room 15 years, he said. "I think I have been waiting, without knowing it, for a reason worth walking back into it for." Eleanor did not need to ask what the reason was. She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, and for once he did not draw it back. The night of the ball, the great hall of Calderwood was lit for the first time in 15 years. Every sconce filled, every chandelier lowered and cleaned and raised again, blazing with new candles. The long table itself moved to one side and dressed for supper. The 22 chairs reduced now, by Julian's own order, to a number that suited the guests actually expected rather than the ghosts who no longer needed seating. Eleanor stood in the doorway in a gown of deep blue silk. New, unfaded, chosen by her own hand for the first time in 2 years, and felt Julian's eyes on her before she turned to find him. "You are not wearing the muslin," he said, low, for her ears only. "I have retired the muslin," she said, "to a place of honor in a drawer I shall likely never open again." He almost smiled, the third time she had counted it now. The corner of his mouth, lifting and catching before it could complete itself, and offered her his arm. And together they walked into the room he had shut 15 years before, and the room, lit and warm and full for the first time since his parents' deaths, did not feel like a church at all. It felt, Eleanor thought, like a held breath finally going out. Her mother arrived within the hour, stiff with a discomfort she disguised, not very well as pride. And Sir Reginald Ashworth arrived a quarter hour after that, dressed with a care that suggested he had not entirely given up hope of the evening's original purpose, despite the small matter of Eleanor already being married to someone else. He found her by the window near the supper table, where she stood a moment apart from the dancing, and bowed with exactly the smoothness she remembered. "Your Grace," he said, the title sitting oddly in his mouth, as though he resented having to use it. "I confess I am surprised to find you so well settled. When I heard of your hasty marriage, I feared you had thrown yourself away entirely. I have found the throwing suited me rather well, Sir Reginald. So it appears." His eyes moved over the room, the restored hall, the assembled guests, with the particular hunger of a man calculating what he had lost. "Though I wonder whether your husband is aware of everything he acquired along with you. Your family's debts, for one, and a certain reputation your mother worked very hard to keep quiet, concerning a young man before myself who was rather less honourable about your affections than he ought to have been. It was a small cruelty, aimed with precision at the one soft place she had never told Julian about, a foolish infatuation 2 years prior, before the money went, with a curate's son who had made promises he had no intention of keeping, and left her, briefly, humiliated in a way her mother had spent considerable effort erasing from local memory, and Eleanor felt her chin come up before she had decided to let it, an old defence reasserting itself. "I do not know what you imagine that story does to me now," Sir Reginald said aloud in a room I am mistress of, to a man I did not marry. "I imagine it does a great deal once your husband hears it from someone other than yourself, and wonders what else you have not told him." She held his gaze a full 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, counting them silently the way she had learned, at moments of highest tension, to count, and felt, beneath the count, the old suppressed sting rising toward her eyes, the near tears she had trained herself for 2 years never to let fall in front of anyone who might use them as a weapon. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She did not let them fall now. "Then he shall hear it from me," she said tonight, in my own words, "and you may find, Sir Reginald, that a man who chose me knowing I had nothing finds very little in my past capable of frightening him away." She left him at the window and found Julian across the room, and told him, quietly, in the alcove by the unlit fourth hearth, the whole small sorry story of the curate's son, watching his face for the flinch she half expected, and did not in the end receive. "I am not marrying the girl you were at 21, he said, when she had finished. "I am married to the woman who sat down beside me on a cold wall and did not ask my permission to see me as I was." Nothing Sir Reginald says changes that. It was, perhaps, the moment she might have cried, the almost held off 2 years, finally within reach of release. But there was no time, because it was in that same moment that a stir moved through the room near the door, and Eleanor's mother's voice rose, sharp and carrying, above the music. "I will not have it said that this family conspired to trap a duke," Mrs. Vance was saying, to a cluster of guests near the entrance, her voice pitched with the particular brittleness of a woman who has decided that attacking is safer than explaining. "My daughter married a common land steward in good faith, believing him exactly what he claimed to be. And if his grace now regrets a marriage made under false pretenses, I assure you the deception was entirely his own, and none of my daughter's making." It was, Eleanor understood at once, her mother's fear talking rather than her malice, the same fear that had pushed her toward Sir Reginald's contract in the first place, the fear of ruin, of scandal, of a daughter's choice, reflecting badly enough on the family name to finish what the failed shipping investments had started. But it landed, in that crowded room, like an accusation against Julian's honour, and a silence spread outward from it that Eleanor felt reach all the way to where she stood. Julian crossed the room before Eleanor could move, and stood before her mother with a stillness that carried more authority than any raised voice could have. "Mrs. Vance," he said, loud enough to be heard by the room, without seeming to shout. "I would correct you on one point, if I may. There was no deception practiced upon your daughter that she did not choose to walk through with her eyes open once the truth was told her. I concealed my name from her before our marriage, and I have regretted the necessity of it every day since. But I did not conceal my character, and it was her own judgment of that character, formed while she believed me to have nothing to offer her but honesty, that led her to accept me." He paused, and his gaze moved, deliberately, to find Eleanor's across the room. "Your daughter reviewed my estate accounts within a fortnight of arriving here, and found 4 years of neglect that my own steward had missed. She has visited every tenant family on this land since Christmas, on foot, in weather that would have kept a lesser woman indoors. She asked for a smaller table built with her own hand's guidance, so that this house might feel, for the first time in 15 years, like a home rather than a mausoleum, and she did it without once asking my permission, because she has never in the time I have known her waited for anyone's permission to do what was right in front of her." His voice did not rise, but it carried, filling every corner of the great hall he had shut for 15 years. "I did not marry a fortune, Mrs. Vance. I had no need of one. I married the only woman who has ever looked at me and seen a man rather than a title, and I would ask this room to remember that. Whatever else is said of her tonight." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Not the held breath of scandal, but something closer to the hush that follows a truth spoken plainly in a room unused to plain speech. Sir Reginald, still near the window, made one last attempt. "A pretty speech, Your Grace. But I wonder whether the room knows the full history of the lady's affections before your own arrival. There was, I understand, a certain curate's son." "There was," Julian said, "before Eleanor could speak, and I know the whole of it, told to me not an hour ago by my wife's own choosing, before you could make it a weapon out of it. I would ask you, Sir Reginald, to consider what it says of your own character that you came to my house tonight, prepared to use a young woman's old heartbreak against her, and what it says of mine that I have already forgiven her for a foolishness she committed at 21, and holds against herself far more harshly than I ever could. I think this room may judge for itself which of us it would rather have as a neighbour." There was, from somewhere near the supper table, a low ripple of agreement, not loud, not triumphant, but unmistakable. And Sir Reginald, finding the room's sympathy had turned entirely against him, made his excuses within the quarter hour, and did not stay for supper. Eleanor's mother remained rooted where she stood, her face working through something that finally, after 2 years of careful concealment, came apart entirely. Not the folding away Eleanor had grown used to, but a genuine crumbling, tears rising in a woman who had spent a decade telling her daughter that tears changed nothing. "I only wanted you settled," she said, to Eleanor, quietly, once the room's attention had moved elsewhere. "I could not bear to watch this family lose everything, and I thought if I did not choose for you, no one would, and we would all of us go under together. I did not know how else to keep you safe. You could have asked me what I wanted, Mama. I was afraid of what you would say." Her mother's hands twisted together, the gesture of a woman who had run out of authority and did not know what remained beneath it. "I was afraid you would say you wanted nothing to do with any of it, and leave me to manage alone." Eleanor looked at her a long moment. Really looked, the way Julian had once looked at her across a fence in the rain, and saw, beneath the brittle authority, a woman as frightened and as powerless, in her own way, as Eleanor herself had been for 2 long years. She did not forgive her entirely. Not that night. Not all at once. But she reached out and took her mother's hand and left the door open a crack, which was, she thought, as much as either of them could manage yet, and perhaps enough for now. Julian found her a little later, standing again near the unlit fourth hearth, and this time, when he reached for her hand, he did not draw back before it landed. He took it fully, in front of the whole assembled room, and said, quietly enough that it was meant only for her, though half the room would later swear they had heard it, "I love you. I have loved you, I think, since a woman sat down on a cold wall beside a stranger and asked no one's permission to see him as he was. I would like the whole of this county to know it, if you will permit me to say so where they can hear." "You have my permission," Eleanor said, and felt, at last, the tears she had held back all evening rise and fall, not from pain this time, but from something so full it had nowhere else to go. And she did not suppress them, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was nothing in the room that tears could cost her. The great hall's table was not shortened in the end. It remained the long table it had always been, 22 chairs restored to their places. But it was used now. Dinners held there each Sunday. The fourth hearth lit and kept lit. The room filled, gradually, with precisely the noise Julian's mother had once said it needed and never quite had enough of. 9 months later, in the warm gold light of a September morning, Eleanor sat at the small round table in the breakfast parlour's bow window, the one with the carved word hidden beneath its surface, known only to the two of them, with an infant daughter asleep against her shoulder, while Julian read the Morning Post across from her with an ease in his shoulders that had taken the better part of a year to arrive, and showed no sign now of ever leaving again. Lady Prudence had come to stay a fortnight for the child's christening, and had been discovered, twice already, humming to the baby in a manner she would have denied under oath. Mrs. Bramwell had taken to leaving the great hall's doors open even when no meal was planned there, simply so the light could reach further into the house than it once had. "You are staring," Eleanor said, without looking up. "I am allowed to stare at my own wife over breakfast." "You did not used to allow yourself very much of anything." "No," Julian agreed, and reached across the small table to rest his hand once more over the place where the carved word sat hidden beneath the wood, a habit he had never entirely broken. "I have found, since a woman sat down at my table without asking permission, that I have grown rather better at allowing things. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from tonight, and let us know what Eleanor and Julian's story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.